We're going to dive right in with Hilary Wandall from Dun & Bradstreet, where she's the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer. And the discussion will be about the strategies to employ when we're thinking about ethical AI. It can be kind of a minefield to even try and figure out what that even means. There's also responsible AI, which is kind of a catch-all term these days. But maybe a good place to start for the audience is to kind of define what that scope looks like for you.
Oh, that's a tough question, Jackie. She's got me started with a hard one. So, you know, it's really interesting. When we started developing at Dun & Bradstreet our approach to ethical AI, we did have a debate around responsible AI versus ethical AI. And in my humble opinion, they're actually one and the same. It's just a different term. Some people are more comfortable using responsibility to define trying to do all things good, where other people feel like being grounded in ethical principles and more traditional approaches to ethics can actually draw parallels to other areas of ethics like behavioral ethics and business ethics. I come actually from a bit of a bioethics experience myself, so you can draw parallels to other areas where ethics have been applied, but I do think it's sort of one and the same for many organizations.
And you weren't starting from scratch, so if we're kind of going back to November 2022 when ChatGPT really took the world by storm, you guys had already started thinking about this and had somewhat of a foundational framework in place. Why don't you kind of talk to us about that preparation and what it was like when generative AI really hit the scene?
Indeed. Well, actually, it was so interesting because I was one of those people who wasn't really paying attention until people started sending me poetry about GDPR that was written by ChatGPT. And I was focused on some other things at the time, so I'm like, what is happening in this universe? But actually, we had been preparing for AI in other ways, not necessarily Gen AI as much as machine learning, natural language processing, as many were already talking about, and what that meant for purposes of our approach to compliance and ethics. So a little bit of a backstory. I joined Dun & Bradstreet about 3.25 years ago, but I had been doing privacy, I had been doing data protection, compliance for quite some time. And one of the things that I had seen, and those of you who have to deal with lawyers and compliance people like me probably have experienced, is that sometimes, we even heard it in the last session, lawyers and compliance people take some time with things. And why do we take time? Well, sometimes it's because there's not enough of us, and there's many things that business people want to do, but also because the laws are complicated. And the more the laws get layered on top of each other, the more complicated it can be. And depending on the kind of law that you practice in your experience, you may be more or less risk averse. So one of the things that we thought about when I joined the company was that the EU AI Act had been introduced already, actually, believe it or not, all the way back in April of 2021. I had been working in around the life sciences space for a long time, and we saw a lot around big data and genomics and where the scaling of all of that was going and some of the risks that were being created as a result. So when I joined Dun & Bradstreet, we looked at how we might be able to take an approach that could be more flexible and actually help spur innovation. So instead of taking a more legalistic approach, we looked at what are the core underlying principles that actually were the basis of what we were seeing across different legal regimes, and how might those become the basis for setting us up for being able to handle data in an ethical way, in a compliant way, but not tied to a particular law or regulation, but looking across all of them to find the commonalities that could give us a framework for being able to address it. So we did that. We actually had adopted a data compliance and ethics framework to support privacy, data protection, all those laws many of you probably hear about from your legal colleagues, or you may have to deal with it yourself. And instead of applying a legalistic approach, we actually applied an approach that looked at core aspects of data governance, knowing your data, what kind of data, where is that data. That's good for business. Knowing your data, actually being able to follow your data through, those were things that, and labeling it properly, those were things we were looking at. And then we applied concepts from other areas of the law, but in a much more flexible way. And we contemplated that we were going to need to do that for whatever kind of technologies may come along to affect data. And then
ChatGPT came along. Well, let's fast forward now, because we are almost 2 years in, and several regulatory regimes have kind of come in with their own views on what ethical AI means, how to put some guardrails around it. In the US, we have the Biden administration's executive order from last year, and I'm curious how that's evolved your thinking around what you already had in place. How often do you revisit something like that when this emerging technology is still underway and many governments are still kind of trying to catch up?
Well, you know what, Jackie, I realized I probably should tell the audience that even though we had developed this framework, some of my colleagues said, you know, we probably should find a way to help guide our business team members in applying it to AI. So we actually adopted an AI ethics policy, very specific. We took those principles and we applied them to AI. And when we did that, we looked at things like, what are our core human-centric principles that show that we have respect for people about whom we process data, respect for companies, for our customers, in that that's embedded inside of it. So we built all of that into our AI ethics policy. I won't go into all the details. Happy to answer questions. But we developed in a way that looked at frameworks coming from the UN and the OECD and lots of what various different bodies around the world had been considering were some of the core issues. So how do you be not only transparent the way organizations have been transparent historically, but how do you apply explainability? So if you're actually allowing a model to go in and do a determination for you, how do you show how the model is using the data and what it's actually deciding? That's actually one of the core things that we thought about. How do you make sure that you're applying risk management principles in a new way? And so we built that in. So just to give a few examples, so when we looked at the laws that were coming, actually before the executive order from the Biden administration, the first country in the world to adopt an AI-specific law was China. Last summer, AI measures, generative AI measures, they specifically adopted, and we looked at what we had already put in place, and what we realized is we're largely there. There's always going to be nuances, like in China, it's very common. You need to actually go and get certain types of technologies or certain use cases registered with the government. And so that was different. It didn't actually apply to us directly. But then fast forward, we got the executive order from the Biden administration. The EU AI Act was continuing to be worked through the European government in all of its processes, going and up into the trilogue procedure. And then we had more, like the Bletchley Declaration. We got more and more, the G7, all these government officials and agencies coming together and looking at what are the core standards. And what we saw is many that we'd already adopted provided us that foundational set of standards where we could continue to explore and ideate, whether we were doing research, applying AI into our products, or coming up with new solutions for our customers together with them in bespoke projects, that we actually had the core underlying foundation to be able to be flexible even with these new things. So now here in the US, we've got Colorado, we've got Utah. They have specific requirements, just like the EU AI Act, in terms of transparency, really making sure people know they're interacting with an AI. Mm-hmm. And if you have those core things embedded in, and you have processes, like we heard from our other panelists on an AI governance council, that's something we adopted as well, then you can look at risk, you can make fast decisions, and you don't get hung up in too much legal evaluation that actually can slow things down, but you're actually looking at it in a much more pragmatic way.
A lot of this is still, to your point, evolving, and it's always going to kind of be, revised and amended. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on about the political implications. Let's say the Biden administration's executive order is scrapped in the event a new administration comes in, for an organization that kind of takes elements of that and applies it to your own bespoke template. What advice would you have for the audience for kind of navigating the changes in frameworks, especially in a different political environment?
So my general advice is have a foundational set of standards that not only frames decision-making, but that everyone in the organization understands what those core principles are. And it doesn't happen overnight, but if you embed them into both your core communications and make sure that those who are frequently communicating within the organization are reinforcing those principles, that they become part of daily decision-making. Training helps, of course, but it's the regular communication with teams as they're developing things. Embedding it into the decision-making process can be so helpful, regardless of what changes. So I want to just start there. One of the things that we've done is we've taken away the siloed approaches to doing different kinds of compliance and legal reviews, and we've pulled them all together into one horizontal approach that actually looks at the outset at what kind of risks are we dealing with? Are we dealing with risks because of the technology? Are we dealing with risks because of the data? Are we dealing with risks because the law prescribes something specific? And we make decisions about that at the outset. And because we use that kind of upfront risk-based decision-making, then if new laws come along with changes, it actually is much easier to address them. And so what I would say for all of you, if you haven't done it already, governance councils are fantastic, really helpful for looking at risk holistically, but apply flexible decision-making that is based on principles. It really can help it can help you flex when changes in the law come. Like one of the things we've seen in privacy law is that there have been a lot of developments that have really fast-tracked post-GDPR. And here in the U.S., we were a little slower, but some of the at the federal level, we still don't have a broad, comprehensive law. We're one of the only countries in the world that doesn't have one. But the states have acted quickly, and what's happened is it's made things pretty complicated for companies that are looking state by state by state. But if you have an underlying framework that supports how people make decisions every day, and they really know and embrace that when they're designing products, when they're evolving processes, when they're bringing in new systems or acquiring new data, it can make it much simpler regardless of what changes.
How do you know you got it right? You know, how do you measure your own progress when it is kind of a, more intangible kind of framework that you're working with, an end goal?
That's a great question, Jesse. How do you know you got it right when you're early on in the process? I would say my own view is sometimes you know you got it right because other people copy you. And so I would say there's companies out there that we've modeled some of our more novel approaches we've taken from learnings that they have adopted. So let me give a specific example. One of the things we were looking at as we were considering how do you do transparency in AI effectively, we knew how we'd do explainability, and our data scientists were phenomenal in thinking about, they call it show your work. And it's awesome because it just shows how the LLM or whatever AI they're using is actually doing the determinations. But from a transparency standpoint, one of the things we didn't want to do is get bogged down in some long thing that nobody's going to read. So for us, we looked at, well, what are tech companies doing around model cards, and some companies around their systems where they're actually not developing just a model, but actually an AI system, and how are they being transparent around that? And then we also looked at what companies were doing around data sheets, and we took an amalgamation of those things and created our own form. And it's new, and whether we got it right or not, I guess time will tell. But I think part of how you know something is right is you don't have to completely undo it. You can continue to build on what you've already built. We always have to iterate. We're always going to be in a place where we have to continuously improve. But I think how you know you got it right in part is because you can continue to build upon what you've already put in place.
Amongst your competitors and just kind of even in different sectors, I'm curious if you have seen broad-based consensus around kind of the basic frameworks that should be in place around ethical AI strategies, or if you're finding that they're kind of wildly different. And curious your thoughts on, when people are kind of looking for a starting point. You've named some good options, but just kind of curious what that debate looks like amongst your peers.
Yeah, it's an evolving place, I think, for many right now, but a lot of people have started by looking at the NIST AI risk management framework. That is one of the most common approaches that people have taken. They've also, and it gets into a bit more detail and really thinking about specific types of AI risk. And NIST is doing a really great job of actually having opportunities for people to actually learn about how to do red teaming, not in the security space, but looking at how do you actually challenge through adversarial techniques the AI itself as to whether it's going to do something problematic. And that, I think, is really, people are interested in being engaged with that. And we've seen certain other frameworks actually get modeled off of that. Others have looked more at the higher level principles. Again, I mentioned the OECD guidelines. I think a lot have built off of the OECD guidelines themselves. And in fact, nobody loves the definition of an AI system, but that actually came from the OECD. And it's flexible enough, especially with its evolution, the change that they made earlier this year, late last year, I can't even keep track of the months anymore, but it's flexible enough to really account for generative AI and a lot of the generation that's coming from AI as well. People are looking to those things, but I think a lot people are going to look to the EU AI Act. In fact, I spent some time over in Asia last month, and one of the things was being debated by folks in the ASEAN nations is that they have done a lot of their own thinking about appropriate frameworks, and they have these sandboxes where people go in and they test things, and they really want people to be able to approach things in a more flexible way rather than the prescriptive way that's come out of the EU. I think at the end of the day, people will do a combination of all, and it really depends on whether they're caught in high-risk systems, Jackie, under the EU AI Act, or whether they can rely more on some of the flexibility that comes from the traditional frameworks that we've seen for the past few years.
Do you find, or have you had conversations, with other people in your company who might disagree with how ethical AI strategies are rolled out, whether it's about this is too expensive or dedicating too many resources? I'm curious if you've received any pushback or what kind of that, dissent might look like.
That's an odd. She keeps asking me some really great questions.
We're here to serve, guys.
Questions, right? So the first hard question that I got, and it was a really important question, was how are you going to make sure this doesn't slow things down? So when we created our governance council for AI, we deliberately inserted the word agile in front of it to make sure we remembered our role was not to create process, but rather was to create agility so people could ideate faster and make faster risk-based decisions. So that was the first pushback I got. And I think we've actually been able, it's been really neat, is we've been able to bring we initially started with a core group of representatives, and we've expanded that to make sure we have really broad representation around the business. The other thing that I got pushback on initially was how do you make sure you don't have separate processes? As I said earlier, we actually added our AI review after it goes through the governance council into the existing reviews, that broad lateral approach to things to help ensure that we didn't slow it down. And we're always challenged as to, well, do we really need to do that? And what's the value in doing that? And the approach that I try to take is, how do we make sure that we are thinking responsibly? I'll go back to the ethics versus responsibility. But to me, part of being ethical is about thinking responsibly about who you're impacting in the world and being thoughtful about how they might receive it. You can't solve for every point on the spectrum, but it generally, when you look at the core stakeholders that you may impact, how are you designing such that they are going to hopefully love it, use it, give feedback, you learn from them, and you can make something better.
You touched on value, and a lot of the previous discussions focused around the ROI, and again, kind of the ROI here is a little bit squishier. But in making that pitch to other members of the C-suite, what would you say the ROI is in kind of rolling these things out? Because it's not just to do good, right? It's also good for business, and I'm curious if you can maybe elaborate on that pitch.
Well, I think it's great for business if you start with, what are we trying to achieve? I mean, part of what we evaluate from a compliance and ethics and legal perspective is, what are we trying to achieve? What's the purpose behind it? And then does the design deliver on that purpose? So if we frame it through the lens of, we need to have some value we're trying to generate, and we together are thinking about, what is that value for whom? How are we going to get there? The actual process of making sure you're responsible, making sure you're compliant, is helping you deliver on those business outcomes as well in a more certain and hopefully measurable way.
Thank you so much, Hilary.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.